The news hit Austin's music scene like lightning on a clear day. Raymond "Thunder" Johnson was coming to town, and he was going to play at the Continental Club. Not the big concert hall downtown, not the fancy theater where most famous musicians performed when they visited Austin. The Continental Club, the small, intimate venue where local musicians had been cutting their teeth for decades. Isabella first heard about it from Carlos during their usual Thursday night gig. He burst into the green room behind the stage, his eyes wide with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," he said, still catching his breath. "Thunder Johnson is playing at Continental next week." Isabella nearly dropped her trumpet. Thunder Johnson was a legend. At 58 years old, he had been playing professionally for over 40 years. He had 3 Grammy Awards, sitting on his mantelpiece, and had played with everyone from the surviving members of Miles Davis's band to modern jazz, fusion groups that kids listened to on streaming services. More than that, Thunder Johnson was known for something that set him apart from other famous musicians. He wasn't content to just play for audiences who already knew and loved jazz. He actively sought out new talent, especially young musicians who were bringing fresh perspectives to the music. But he was also known for testing them in ways that could either make or break their confidence. "Are you serious?" Isabella asked, still processing the information. "Dead serious," Carlos replied. "My cousin works at Continental and she says they've been planning this for months but keeping it quiet. It's going to be announced tomorrow morning, but tickets go on sale immediately. And knowing Continental, they'll probably sell out in about 10 minutes. Isabella's mind was racing. Thunder Johnson was her musical hero. She had every album he had ever recorded, including the rare live recordings that you could only find in specialty music stores. She had studied his solos note by note, trying to understand how he could make the trumpet sound like it was having a conversation with the audience. But more than his technical ability, Isabella admired Thunder Johnson for his journey. He had grown up in Detroit during the 1970s, when the city was struggling economically and many young people had limited opportunities. Music had been his way out, but not in the way most people expected. Instead of leaving his community behind when he became successful, he had consistently returned to Detroit to work with young musicians, to fund music programs in schools, and to prove that jazz was not just music. For wealthy people in expensive concert halls, Thunder Johnson played what people called people's jazz. It was sophisticated and complex enough to impress other musicians, but it was also emotional and accessible enough that someone hearing jazz for the first time could connect with it immediately. The announcement went live the next morning at 9 a.m. Isabella was sitting at her computer with her credit card ready, refreshing the Continental Club's website every few seconds. When the tickets became available, she managed to snag one of the last seats in the front row. The entire show sold out in 12 minutes. For the next week, Isabella could barely concentrate on anything else. She practiced extra hours every day, not because she had any specific reason to, but because knowing Thunder Johnson would be in the same city made her want to be at her absolute best. She listened to his albums with fresh ears, trying to pick up nuances she might have missed before. The Continental Club was buzzing with energy on the night of the show. Isabella arrived an hour early and found a spot at the bar where she could watch the sound technicians set up the stage. She had brought her trumpet case with her, not because she planned to play, but because she never went anywhere without it. It was like a security blanket. Other local musicians were scattered throughout the club. Isabella recognized many faces from the Austin jazz scene: piano players, bass players, drummers, and a few other horn players. Everyone was talking in hushed, excited tones about what they might hear that night. When Thunder Johnson walked onto the stage at 9 p.m. sharp, the room fell completely silent. He was smaller than Isabella had expected, maybe 5 feet 8 inches tall, with silver hair and glasses that made him look more like a college professor than a musical legend. But when he picked up his trumpet and played the first note of the evening, every person in that room understood why he was considered one of the greatest musicians alive. His tone was incredible, warm and rich, but with an edge that could cut through any background noise. His technique was flawless, but it never felt like he was showing off. Every note seemed to serve the music, not his ego. The first song was a standard that Isabella knew well, but Thunder Johnson's interpretation made it sound like she was hearing it for the first time. He took the familiar melody and deconstructed it, rebuilt it, and decorated it with his own musical personality, while never losing the essence of what made the song special in the first place. The second song showcased his ability to play with different styles. It started as a slow ballad but gradually transformed into an up-tempo swing number, then shifted into a Latin rhythm, and finally returned to the original ballad style. Throughout all these changes, Thunder Johnson's playing remained coherent and purposeful. But it was during the third song that Isabella realized what made Thunder Johnson truly special. He wasn't just playing music. He was telling stories. The song was about lost love, and his trumpet seemed to capture every emotion associated with that experience. The initial happiness, the gradual realization that something was wrong, the pain of separation, and finally, the bittersweet acceptance that comes with moving forward. Isabella found herself with tears in her eyes, not because the music was sad, but because it was so honest and authentic. This was what her grandmother had meant when she said that music came from the heart, not just from the fingers. The audience was completely captivated. During most jazz performances, there was a certain amount of background conversation, the clink of glasses, and the general ambient noise of people enjoying an evening out. But during Thunder Johnson's performance, the Continental Club was as quiet as a library. Everyone was hanging on every note. Between songs, Thunder Johnson talked to the audience in a way that was both professional and personal. He shared stories about the songs he was playing, about the musicians who had influenced him, and about his love for discovering new talent in cities across the country. "One of the things I love most about playing in clubs like this," he said during one break, "is that you never know who might be in the audience. Some of the best musicians I know started out sitting right where you're sitting now, just listening and learning and dreaming about what it would be like to be up here." Isabella felt like he was speaking directly to her. She shifted in her chair and noticed that her trumpet case was visible beside her seat. She had a sudden, uncomfortable feeling that Thunder Johnson might have noticed it too. As the evening progressed, Thunder Johnson's playing seemed to get even better. It was like he was feeding off the energy of the audience, and they were responding to his musical generosity by giving him their complete attention. The mutual respect between performer and audience was creating something magical. Isabella had been to hundreds of musical performances in her life, but she had never experienced anything quite like this. It wasn't just that Thunder Johnson was technically excellent. There were lots of technically excellent musicians. It was that he seemed to understand something fundamental about what music was supposed to do. It was supposed to create connection between people, to make them feel less alone, to remind them that their experiences and emotions were shared by others. When Thunder Johnson announced that he had one more song to play, Isabella felt a mixture of disappointment that the evening was ending and gratitude that she had been able to witness something truly special. She had no idea that the evening was far from over, and that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Thunder Johnson finished his last planned song to thunderous applause. The audience was on their feet, clapping and cheering with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for rock concerts. Isabella was clapping so hard her hands were starting to hurt, but she couldn't stop. She had just witnessed something extraordinary. Thunder Johnson took a bow and waved to the crowd, his trumpet still in his left hand. Isabella expected him to walk off stage, maybe return for a quick encore, and then disappear into whatever private world famous musicians inhabited when they weren't performing. But instead of leaving, Thunder Johnson remained on stage. He waited for the applause to die down, then leaned into the microphone with a smile that suggested the evening wasn't quite over yet. "You know," he said, his voice carrying easily over the now quiet room, "one of the things I love about playing in intimate venues like this is the opportunity to connect with other musicians. And I have a feeling there might be some musicians in the audience tonight." Isabella felt her stomach flutter. She glanced around the room and noticed several other people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Most of the local jazz scene was represented in the audience, and Thunder Johnson seemed to be scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who could spot a musician from across a crowded room. "In fact," Thunder Johnson continued, "I've been noticing that trumpet case sitting right there in the front row all evening." Isabella's heart stopped. She looked down at her grandmother's trumpet case, sitting innocently beside her chair, and realized that Thunder Johnson was looking directly at her. The entire audience seemed to turn in unison to see what he was looking at. "Young lady," Thunder Johnson said, his voice kind but carrying the authority of someone who was used to being listened to, "do you play that trumpet, or are you just carrying it around for decoration?" The blood rushed to Isabella's face. She could feel everyone in the club staring at her, waiting for her response. Her mouth went dry, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. Yes, I play, she managed to say, her voice barely audible. I thought so, Thunder Johnson said with satisfaction. I could tell by the way you've been listening tonight. Real musicians listen differently than regular audience members. They hear things that other people miss. Isabella wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or terrified. Probably both. What's your name? Thunder Johnson asked. Isabella, she replied, her voice a little stronger now. Well, Isabella, how would you like to come up here and play something with me? The question hit Isabella like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin around her. This couldn't be happening. Famous musicians didn't just invite random people on stage, especially not at professional performances. There had to be some mistake. I don't think, Isabella started to say, but Thunder Johnson cut her off. Now, before you say no, he said, let me tell you something. I've been playing music professionally for 40 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts about people. Something tells me you didn't just happen to end up in the front row of this show by accident. Something tells me you're serious about music. Isabella looked around the room. Every face was turned toward her, filled with curiosity and anticipation. She recognized some of the local musicians in the audience, people she had performed with, people whose respect she had worked hard to earn. What would they think if she went up there and embarrassed herself in front of their musical hero? But then she thought about her grandmother Rosa, and all those evenings on the front porch, learning that music was about sharing feelings, not just playing notes correctly. Rosa had always told her that opportunities came disguised as scary situations, and that the only real failure was not trying. Actually, Thunder Johnson said, as if reading her mind, let me make this more interesting. How about we have ourselves a little musical conversation? A friendly duel, you might say. The word duel sent a murmur through the audience. Everyone knew that Thunder Johnson was famous for his musical duels with other professional musicians. These weren't just casual jam sessions. They were intense musical exchanges where both players pushed each other to their limits. A duel? Isabella asked, her voice cracking slightly. Nothing too serious, Thunder Johnson said with a grin. Just a friendly exchange of musical ideas. I'll play something, you respond with something of your own. We'll see where the music takes us. Isabella realized that this was one of those moments that would define the rest of her life. She could politely decline, stay in her seat, and spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened. Or she could take the biggest risk of her musical career and see what she was really made of. She thought about all the hours she had spent practicing in her bedroom, all the local gigs where she had proven herself, all the late nights spent studying Thunder Johnson's recordings. Maybe all of that had been preparation for this exact moment. Okay, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Let's do it! The audience erupted in applause and excited chatter. Isabella stood up on shaky legs and picked up her trumpet case. The walk from her table to the stage felt like it took forever, but it was probably only 15 seconds. Thunder Johnson met her at the side of the stage and extended his hand. I'm Thunder, he said simply, as if they were meeting at a casual gathering instead of in front of a room full of people who were about to witness either a magical musical moment or a complete disaster. Isabella, she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and warm, and surprisingly his presence was calming rather than intimidating. You nervous? He asked quietly, so only she could hear. Terrified, Isabella admitted. Thunder Johnson laughed. Good, that means you care about the music. The day you stop getting nervous before you play is the day you should probably find a different hobby. Isabella opened her trumpet case and lifted out her grandmother's instrument. Under the stage lights, the old brass seemed to glow with its own inner warmth. She ran her fingers over the familiar dents and worn spots, drawing comfort from their familiarity. That's a beautiful instrument, Thunder Johnson observed. It looks like it has some history. It was my grandmother's, Isabella said. She taught me everything I know about music. Then she's up there watching tonight, Thunder Johnson said with a smile. Let's make her proud. Thunder Johnson walked to the center of the stage and picked up his trumpet. Isabella followed, trying to ignore the fact that her hands were shaking slightly. The stage lights were brighter than she was used to, and the audience seemed much larger from up here than it had from her seat. Ladies and gentlemen, Thunder Johnson announced to the crowd. Isabella has agreed to engage in a little musical conversation with me. The rules are simple. I'll play something, she'll respond, and we'll see what kind of story we can tell together. He turned to Isabella. You ready? Isabella took a deep breath, placed her trumpet to her lips, and nodded. She had no idea what was about to happen, but she knew there was no turning back now. Whatever came next would either be the beginning of something incredible, or a learning experience she would never forget. Either way, her grandmother Rosa would have been proud of her for having the courage to try. Thunder Johnson raised his trumpet and smiled at her one more time. Let's make some music, he said. The audience fell completely silent, and Isabella realized that her life was about to change forever. Thunder Johnson lifted his trumpet to his lips and began to play. The first notes that emerged were smooth and confident, a bebop phrase that danced around the melody like a boxer circling his opponent. His fingers moved across the valves with lightning speed, creating a cascade of notes that somehow never felt rushed or chaotic. Each note was perfectly placed, perfectly timed, and perfectly intentioned. Isabella listened intently, trying to decode the musical message Thunder Johnson was sending her. This wasn't just showing off, though his technical skill was undeniable. He was establishing the rules of their conversation, showing her what kind of musical language they would be speaking together. The phrase he played was complex, but not impossible. It was challenging enough to test her abilities, but not so difficult that she would be completely lost. Isabella realized that Thunder Johnson was being both generous and strategic. He wanted to push her, but he also wanted her to succeed. When Thunder Johnson finished his opening statement, he lowered his trumpet and looked at Isabella expectantly. The entire club was silent, waiting to see how she would respond. Isabella took a deep breath and raised her grandmother's trumpet. Instead of trying to match Thunder Johnson's technical complexity note for note, she chose a different approach. She played the same basic melody that he had used, but she stripped it down to its emotional core. Where Thunder Johnson had been athletic and precise, Isabella was lyrical and expressive. Her notes were longer, more connected, and they seemed to breathe with a life of their own. She wasn't trying to prove that she could play as fast as Thunder Johnson. She was trying to show him that she understood what the music was really about. Her response lasted about 30 seconds, and when she finished, she could see something change in Thunder Johnson's expression. He nodded slightly, as if she had just passed some kind of test she didn't even know she was taking. Thunder Johnson raised his trumpet again and played a more complex phrase, this time incorporating some advanced harmonic concepts that Isabella recognized from her late-night practice sessions. But again, he wasn't just showing off. He was asking her a musical question. Can you handle this? Isabella's response this time was more confident. She took the harmonic framework that Thunder Johnson had established and built on it, adding her own melodic ideas while staying true to the overall structure he had created. Her playing was becoming more fluid, more natural, as her nervousness began to transform into excitement. The audience was completely captivated. What had started as a potentially awkward situation had quickly evolved into something magical. These two musicians, who had never played together before, were creating music in real time that was both cohesive and surprising. Thunder Johnson smiled and launched into his third phrase, this one even more challenging. His playing was getting more aggressive now, not in an angry way, but with the kind of intensity that comes when a musician is fully engaged with the music in the moment. His notes were sharp and precise, cutting through the air like a sword. Isabella felt something shift inside her as she listened. The nervousness was completely gone now, replaced by a fierce determination to meet Thunder Johnson's challenge head-on. When it was her turn to respond, she played with a power and confidence that surprised even her. Her notes were strong and clear, matching Thunder Johnson's intensity while maintaining her own musical personality. She was no longer thinking about the audience, no longer worried about making mistakes. She was completely focused on the music and on the conversation she was having with one of her musical heroes. The duel continued for several more exchanges, each one building on what had come before. Thunder Johnson would present a musical idea, and Isabella would respond with her own interpretation or elaboration. Sometimes she would completely transform his phrase into something new. Other times she would take a small element of what he had played and develop it into something unexpected. What was remarkable was how well they were listening to each other. Despite having never played together before, they were anticipating each other's musical moves, leaving space for each other's ideas, and building on each other's creativity. The audience was witnessing something that rarely happened, even among professional musicians who had been playing together for years. Thunder Johnson and Isabella had achieved that magical state of musical communication where two individual voices became one unified expression. About 10 minutes into the duel, Thunder Johnson played a phrase that was unlike anything he had played before. It was slower, more introspective, with a haunting quality that seemed to echo the stories of every blues musician who had ever lived. His playing was still technically perfect, but now it was also deeply emotional. Isabella closed her eyes and let the feeling of his music wash over her. When she responded, she drew on every experience she had ever had, growing up on the border, listening to her grandmother's stories, feeling like an outsider in some of Austin's music circles, and the joy of finally finding her place in the world through music. Her response was heartbreaking in its honesty. The notes seemed to tell the story of every young person who had ever dreamed of something bigger than their circumstances seemed to allow. It was personal and universal at the same time, and it connected with something deep in the hearts of everyone listening. Thunder Johnson stopped playing altogether and just listened as Isabella continued her solo. Her playing had transcended technique and entered the realm of pure expression. She was no longer a young musician trying to prove herself. She was an artist sharing her truth with the world. When Isabella finished her solo, the silence in the club was profound. Nobody moved or spoke for several seconds, as if the entire audience was afraid that any sound might break the spell that had been cast. Thunder Johnson was staring at Isabella with an expression that was equal parts amazement and respect. In all his years of musical duels with other professional musicians, he had rarely encountered someone who could match his technical skill while also bringing something genuinely new to the conversation. But Isabella wasn't finished yet. She looked at Thunder Johnson and nodded toward his trumpet, indicating that she wanted him to continue. She had found her confidence now, and she was ready for whatever he might throw at her next. Thunder Johnson grinned and raised his trumpet again. The second half of their duel was about to begin, and both musicians knew that they had already created something special. Now they wanted to see just how far they could push it. The audience sensed the shift in energy and leaned forward in anticipation. What they had witnessed so far had been extraordinary, but somehow everyone in the room knew that the best was yet to come. Thunder Johnson paused and looked out at the audience, then back at Isabella. Something had changed in his demeanor. The playful, encouraging energy of the first part of their duel had been replaced by something more serious, more intense. Isabella could sense that he was about to present her with his greatest challenge yet. "Isabella," he said, speaking into the microphone so the whole audience could hear, "what we've done so far has been beautiful, but I want to see what you're really made of. I'm going to play something that I wrote 25 years ago, a piece that I composed for one of my heroes, Charlie Parker. It's called Flight of the Phoenix, and it's one of the most difficult pieces I've ever written." A murmur went through the audience. Many of the local musicians recognized the name of the composition. Flight of the Phoenix was legendary in jazz circles, a piece so technically demanding that very few musicians had ever attempted to perform it publicly. It required not just incredible speed and precision, but also the ability to navigate complex harmonic changes while maintaining musical coherence. Isabella felt her mouth go dry. She had heard of this piece, had even tried to learn parts of it during her private practice sessions, but she had never imagined she would be asked to perform it in front of an audience, especially not in a duel with its composer. "Now," Thunder Johnson continued, "I'm not asking you to play it exactly as I wrote it. That would be unfair, since you've probably never seen the sheet music, but I want you to listen to what I play, and then show me what you would do with the same musical ideas. Show me your version of the Phoenix Rising." Thunder Johnson raised his trumpet, took a deep breath, and began to play Flight of the Phoenix. The opening notes were deceptively simple, a slow, mournful melody that seemed to represent the phoenix in its dying moments. But gradually the music began to build. The tempo increased, the harmonies became more complex, and Thunder Johnson's playing became more intense. As the piece progressed, Isabella could hear the story it was telling. The phoenix was struggling, fighting against the flames that were consuming it. Thunder Johnson's trumpet seemed to cry out in pain and defiance, the notes becoming more urgent and desperate. Then came the transformation. The music shifted into a different key, and suddenly the phoenix was no longer dying. It was being reborn. Thunder Johnson's playing soared into the upper register of the trumpet, his notes becoming bright and powerful and triumphant. The technical demands of the piece were staggering. Thunder Johnson's fingers flew across the valves in patterns that seemed almost impossible. His breathing control was perfect, allowing him to sustain long, powerful notes even while playing at breakneck speed. His embouchure, the way he positioned his lips on the mouthpiece, remained stable and controlled throughout passages that would have defeated most professional musicians. But what made the performance truly extraordinary was that Thunder Johnson never let the technical complexity overshadow the emotional content of the music. Every impossible passage served the story he was telling. Every display of virtuosity had a purpose beyond mere showing off. As the piece reached its climax, Thunder Johnson played a series of ascending runs that seemed to lift the phoenix higher and higher into the sky. His trumpet sang with a voice that was both human and otherworldly, capturing the magical moment when death transforms into rebirth, when ending becomes beginning. When Thunder Johnson played the final note, a long, sustained high note that seemed to hang in the air forever, the audience sat in stunned silence. They had just witnessed one of the greatest trumpet performances many of them would ever hear in their lives. Thunder Johnson lowered his trumpet and looked at Isabella. His eyes were kind, but they were also challenging. He had just played one of his most demanding compositions flawlessly, and now he was asking her to respond with something equally powerful. Isabella felt the weight of the moment. Everyone in the club was looking at her, waiting to see what she would do. She could play it safe, offer a simple response that acknowledged Thunder Johnson's superiority, and gracefully concede the duel. No one would blame her for that approach. But something inside Isabella rebelled against that idea. She thought about her grandmother Rosa, who had taught her that music was about courage as much as technique. She thought about all the times she had been underestimated because of her age or her background. She thought about every young musician who had ever been told that their dreams were too big for their circumstances. Isabella closed her eyes and raised her grandmother's trumpet to her lips. She wasn't going to try to play Flight of the Phoenix exactly as Thunder Johnson had written it. Instead, she was going to deconstruct it, reimagine it, and rebuild it with her own musical voice. She began with the same mournful melody that Thunder Johnson had used to open the piece, but she played it with a different emotional quality. Where his phoenix had died in flames, hers seemed to die of exhaustion, worn down by years of struggling against a world that didn't understand its beauty. As Isabella continued, she began to incorporate musical elements from her own background. The dying phoenix began to sound like the mariachi funeral songs she had heard at family gatherings, slow and stately and filled with dignity even in sorrow. But then, just as Thunder Johnson had done, Isabella began the transformation. Her phoenix didn't rise from flames. It rose from the earth itself, growing slowly and organically like a plant reaching toward the sun. Her playing took on the rhythmic patterns of conjunto music, the celebratory sound of border communities that had learned to find joy even in difficult circumstances. The harmonic structure that Thunder Johnson had built became the foundation for Isabella's own musical architecture. She kept his brilliant chord progressions but decorated them with melodic ideas that spoke of her own experience, her own understanding of what it meant to be reborn. As her phoenix began to soar, Isabella's playing took on a power and confidence that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She wasn't just copying Thunder Johnson's technical pyrotechnics. She was creating her own version of virtuosity, one that combined speed and precision with emotional depth and cultural authenticity. Her phoenix flew not just upward, but outward, embracing the whole world in its flight. Isabella's trumpet sang with the voice of every person who had ever overcome obstacles, who had ever transformed pain into beauty, who had ever refused to let circumstances define their possibilities. When Isabella reached what she felt should be the climax of her version, she did something that no one expected. Instead of ending with a triumphant high note like Thunder Johnson had done, she brought the music back down to earth, to the simple, beautiful melody that her grandmother had taught her on their front porch all those years ago. Her phoenix didn't disappear into the sky. It came home, transformed but still connected to its roots, ready to share what it had learned with the next generation. When Isabella played her final note, the silence in the Continental Club was absolute. Thunder Johnson was staring at her with an expression unlike anything she had ever seen before. It wasn't just admiration or respect, it was recognition. He was looking at her as an equal, as a fellow artist who had just shown him something new about his own music. For what felt like an eternity, nobody in the Continental Club moved or made a sound. Thunder Johnson stood on stage, his trumpet hanging loosely at his side, staring at Isabella with an expression that seemed to cycle through amazement, confusion, and something that looked almost like gratitude. Isabella lowered her grandmother's trumpet, suddenly feeling the full weight of what had just happened. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. She had just taken one of Thunder Johnson's most celebrated compositions and completely reimagined it, adding her own cultural influences and personal story to create something that was both familiar and entirely new. The silence stretched on until Isabella began to worry that she had somehow offended Thunder Johnson or crossed some unspoken boundary in their musical conversation. Maybe she had been too bold, too presumptuous in deconstructing his masterpiece. Then Thunder Johnson began to clap. It started as slow, deliberate applause, each clap distinct and purposeful. But gradually, his clapping became faster and more enthusiastic, and his face broke into a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire stage. The audience, as if released from a spell, erupted into the most thunderous applause Isabella had ever heard. People were not just clapping, they were standing, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. The local musicians in the audience were applauding, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for their own personal heroes. But Isabella barely noticed the audience reaction because she was focused entirely on Thunder Johnson. He walked over to her, still clapping, and when he reached her, he did something completely unexpected. He set down his trumpet and pulled her into a hug. "In 30 years of professional playing," he said, speaking directly into her ear so she could hear him over the continuing applause, "no one has ever done what you just did to my music. No one has ever shown me something about my own composition that I didn't already know." When Thunder Johnson released her from the hug, Isabella could see that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What you just played," he continued, "wasn't just a response to my piece. It was a conversation with it. You took my phoenix and showed me that it could be something different, something more connected to the earth and to community. You showed me that rebirth doesn't have to mean leaving everything behind. It can mean coming home with new wisdom." Thunder Johnson picked up the microphone that was standing on a stand nearby. The audience gradually quieted down, sensing that he had something important to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thunder Johnson announced, "what you just witnessed is why I love music more than anything else in the world. Music has the power to surprise us, to teach us, to show us things about ourselves and our world that we never knew before." He gestured toward Isabella, who was still trying to process what had happened. "This young woman just taught me something about a piece of music that I wrote 25 years ago. She didn't just play my composition. She transformed it, made it into something new while honoring everything that made it special in the first place. That's not just technical skill, folks. That's artistry." The audience burst into applause again. But Thunder Johnson held up his hand to indicate that he wasn't finished speaking. "Isabella," he said, turning back to her, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. I'm starting a national tour next month, 20 cities in 8 weeks. I had planned to do it as a solo tour, just me and my trumpet. But after what I heard tonight, I think that would be a mistake." Isabella felt her knees go weak. She couldn't possibly be hearing what she thought she was hearing. "Would you consider joining me on that tour? Not as my opening act, not as my student, but as my partner. Equal billing, equal creative input, equal respect. We could create a show that combines both of our musical voices, that tells a story about how different generations and different cultures can create something beautiful together." The audience gasped audibly. This was unprecedented. Thunder Johnson was one of the most successful jazz musicians in the world, and he was offering to share his tour with someone he had met less than 2 hours ago. Isabella's mind was racing. A national tour with Thunder Johnson would change her life completely. It would mean leaving Austin, leaving the comfortable local scene where she had built her reputation, and stepping into a world of professional music that she had only dreamed about. but it would also mean taking the biggest risk of her life. What if she couldn't handle the pressure of performing in large venues night after night? What if the chemistry they had discovered tonight didn't translate to other cities, other audiences? What if she embarrassed herself on a national stage? Isabella started to say, then stopped. She looked out at the audience and saw the faces of local musicians who had become her friends and mentors over the past few years. Some of them looked excited for her opportunity, while others seemed worried about losing her to the bigger music world. "I need to think about it," Isabella said finally. This is incredible, and I'm honored that you would even consider it, but it's also a huge decision." Thunder Johnson nodded with understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But let me tell you something. Opportunities like this don't come along very often, and based on what I heard tonight, I think you're ready for this kind of challenge." He turned back to the microphone. "Folks, that's going to be all for tonight. Thank you for witnessing something truly special with us." As the audience began to disperse, many people approached the stage wanting to talk to both Thunder Johnson and Isabella. Local musicians congratulated Isabella with a mixture of pride and amazement. Several audience members asked for autographs, which felt surreal to Isabella since she had never been asked for an autograph in her life. But through all the congratulations and excitement, Isabella found herself thinking about her grandmother Rosa. What would Rosa have advised her to do in this situation? Would she have encouraged Isabella to take the safe path and stay in Austin? Or would she have pushed her to chase this incredible opportunity? Thunder Johnson spent about 30 minutes talking with fans and local musicians, but eventually the crowd began to thin out. He approached Isabella, who was carefully packing her grandmother's trumpet back into its case. "Isabella," he said quietly, "I meant what I said up there. I've been playing music professionally for 4 decades. And I've collaborated with some of the greatest musicians alive. But what happened tonight was special, even by those standards." Isabella looked up at him, still trying to process everything that had occurred. "The tour starts in 6 weeks, Thunder Johnson continued. "That gives you time to think about it, time to prepare if you decide to say yes. But I want you to know that this isn't charity or some kind of publicity stunt. I'm asking you to join me because I think we can create something together that neither of us could create alone." He handed her a business card with his personal phone number written on the back. "Call me when you've made your decision," he said. "But whatever you decide, keep playing. The world needs musicians like you." As Thunder Johnson walked away, Isabella sat alone on the edge of the stage, holding her grandmother's trumpet case and trying to understand how her life had just completely changed in the span of 2 hours. The Continental Club was nearly empty now. Just a few staff members cleaning up and the sound technician breaking down the equipment. Isabella realized that she was probably the only person in the building who understood that tonight hadn't just been a performance. It had been the beginning of a completely new chapter in her life. Isabella spent the next 3 days in a fog of uncertainty and excitement. Thunder Johnson's business card sat on her kitchen table, and she found herself staring at it during breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She had picked up her phone to call him at least a dozen times, but each time she had put it back down without dialing. The problem wasn't that she didn't want to go on tour with Thunder Johnson. The problem was that she wanted it too much, and that scared her. Her grandmother Rosa had always taught her to be suspicious of things that seemed too good to be true. But on Thursday morning, everything changed. Isabella was sitting in her favorite coffee shop, trying to work up the courage to make the phone call, when Carlos burst through the door with his laptop under his arm and an expression of barely contained excitement on his face. "Isabella," he said, practically running to her table, "you need to see this." He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. It was a video titled "Young Musician Challenges Jazz Legend. You Won't Believe What Happens Next." The thumbnail showed Isabella and Thunder Johnson on stage at the Continental Club. "Someone recorded your duel," Carlos explained, "and it's gone viral." "Like really viral?" Isabella stared at the screen in disbelief. The video had been posted 3 days ago and already had over 2 million views. The comments section was filled with messages from people all over the world who had been moved by the performance. "This is insane," one comment read. "I've never heard anything like this. These 2 musicians are speaking the same language but with completely different accents, and somehow it works perfectly." Another comment said, "I'm not even a jazz fan, but this gave me chills." You can actually see the moment when the older musician realizes he's met his match. Carlos scrolled down to show Isabella more comments. There were messages from music students saying the performance had inspired them to practice harder, from professional musicians expressing their admiration for both performers, and from people who had never listened to jazz before but were now interested in learning more about the genre. But that's not even the best part, Carlos said, his excitement barely contained. Look at this. He showed Isabella an email that had been forwarded to him by the owner of the Continental Club. It was from a producer at a major record label, asking for contact information for both Thunder Johnson and Isabella. There were similar emails from booking agents, music festival organizers, and television producers. Isabella, Carlos said seriously, this isn't just about the tour anymore. This video has changed everything. People want to hear more of this music you and Thunder Johnson created together. Isabella felt overwhelmed. She had grown up thinking that success in music came gradually, through years of hard work and slow building of reputation. She had never imagined that one performance could change everything so dramatically. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Thunder Johnson's number. Isabella. Thunder Johnson's voice was warm but urgent when she answered. I'm assuming you've seen the video by now. I just found out about it, Isabella replied. This is crazy. It's more than crazy, Thunder Johnson said. It's unprecedented. I've been getting calls all morning from people who want to book us for festivals, television appearances, recording sessions. The demand is incredible. Isabella could hear the excitement in his voice, but also something else, a sense of responsibility. Listen, Thunder Johnson continued. I know this probably feels overwhelming. 3 days ago you were playing local gigs in Austin, and now there are people all over the world who know your name. But I want you to understand something important. This isn't a fluke or a gimmick. What we created on that stage was real, and people recognize that authenticity. Isabella took a deep breath. What are you saying? I'm saying that my original offer has evolved. Instead of just a tour, I think we should talk about a real partnership. Recording an album together, doing a major tour, maybe even developing a long-term collaboration. But only if that's what you want. Isabella looked around the coffee shop, at the familiar faces of Austin locals going about their daily routines. This was her world, her comfort zone. Leaving it behind felt both thrilling and terrifying. Can I ask you something? Isabella said. Why me? You could collaborate with any musician in the world. Why take a chance on someone who was completely unknown a week ago? Thunder Johnson was quiet for a moment before answering. 25 years ago, when I wrote Flight of the Phoenix, I thought I was writing about my own journey. Rising from poverty in Detroit, overcoming obstacles, achieving success. But when you played your version of that piece, you showed me that the Phoenix isn't just about individual triumph. It's about community, about staying connected to your roots while still growing and changing. He paused, and Isabella could hear the emotion in his voice. You didn't just play my music differently, Isabella. You helped me understand what my music was really about. That's not something you can teach or learn. That's something that comes from who you are as a person and as an artist. Isabella felt tears forming in her eyes. She thought about her grandmother Rosa, about all those evenings on the front porch learning that music was about sharing feelings, not just playing notes correctly. If I say yes, Isabella asked, what happens to my life here in Austin? That's up to you, Thunder Johnson replied. Austin will always be here. The local music scene will always welcome you back. But opportunities like this, they don't wait around forever. Isabella made her decision in that moment, sitting in a coffee shop in Austin with her friend Carlos watching her anxiously, and strangers all over the world discussing her music online. Okay, she said, let's do it. But I have some conditions. Name them, Thunder Johnson said immediately. First, I want to make sure that some of our tour dates include smaller venues, places like the Continental Club where local musicians can see us perform and maybe even sit in with us sometimes. I don't want to lose connection with the grassroots music scene. Agreed, Thunder Johnson said. What else? Second, I want our music to reflect both of our backgrounds honestly. I don't want to just be the young woman who plays with the famous jazz musician. I want our collaboration to be a real meeting of equals, where both of our voices are heard clearly. That's exactly what I want too, Thunder Johnson said. Anything else? Isabella thought about her grandmother's trumpet, about the family traditions that had shaped her musical voice. about the responsibility she felt to represent her community well. Third, I want to establish a scholarship fund for young musicians from underrepresented communities. A percentage of our earnings should go toward helping kids who might not otherwise have access to musical education. Thunder Johnson was quiet, for so long that Isabella wondered if the call had been disconnected. "Thunder," she said, "are you still there?" "I'm here," he replied, and she could hear that he was smiling. "I was just thinking that I made the right choice in asking you to be my partner. Yes to all of your conditions." "And Isabella?" "Yes? Welcome to the big leagues. I have a feeling we're going to create something amazing together." 3 years later, Isabella stood backstage at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., holding her grandmother's trumpet and watching Thunder Johnson warm up for what would be their most important performance yet. Their album Bridge had just won 2 Grammy Awards, and tonight they were performing for an audience that included music educators, government officials, and representatives from music schools across the country. The transformation in both their lives had been extraordinary, but it hadn't always been easy. Their first tour together had been a learning experience for both of them. Thunder Johnson had to adjust to sharing the spotlight with a partner whose musical ideas sometimes challenged his own. Isabella had to learn how to perform in large venues, how to handle the pressure of expectations, and how to maintain her authenticity while adapting to different audiences every night. But somewhere around their 15th show, something clicked. They stopped thinking of themselves as 2 separate musicians performing together and started functioning as a true musical unit. Their improvisations became more intuitive, their compositions more collaborative, and their stage presence more natural. The album Bridge had been recorded 6 months into their partnership. Instead of simply documenting their individual playing styles, they had created something entirely new, a musical language that incorporated Thunder Johnson's technical mastery and jazz tradition with Isabella's cultural influences and emotional directness. The title track, Bridge, was an 18-minute composition that told the story of their musical meeting. It began with Thunder Johnson playing alone, establishing his traditional jazz voice. Gradually, Isabella's trumpet joined in, at first echoing his phrases, then diverging into her own cultural territory. By the end of the piece, their 2 voices had merged into something that was neither traditional jazz nor traditional mariachi, but something entirely new that honored both traditions. The album had been both a critical and commercial success, but more importantly, it had started conversations about collaboration, cultural exchange, and the evolution of musical traditions. Music schools began inviting Isabella and Thunder Johnson to give masterclasses, where they demonstrated how musicians from different backgrounds could learn from each other while maintaining their individual voices. Tonight's performance at the Kennedy Center was the culmination of their 3-year partnership, but it was also the beginning of something new. They were here to announce the establishment of the Bridge Foundation, a national program that would provide musical education and instruments to young people from underrepresented communities. "You ready for this?" Thunder Johnson asked, looking up from his trumpet. Isabella nodded, though she still felt nervous before every major performance. "I keep thinking about what my grandmother would say if she could see this. She'd probably tell you to stop overthinking and just play from the heart." Thunder Johnson replied with a smile. Isabella laughed. "That's exactly what she would say." The stage manager gave them their 5-minute warning. Isabella and Thunder Johnson made their way to the side of the stage and looked out at the audience. The Kennedy Center's concert hall was filled to capacity with people who had come to hear the music that had been captivating audiences across the country. "You know," Thunder Johnson said quietly, 3 years ago I thought I was at the peak of my career. I had accomplished everything I had set out to do as a musician. But working with you has shown me that there's no such thing as a peak if you're willing to keep learning and growing." Isabella felt the familiar pre-performance butterflies in her stomach, but they were accompanied by a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you for taking a chance on me that night in Austin. Thank you for showing me that taking chances is how we keep music alive," Thunder Johnson replied. The stage manager signaled that it was time. Isabella and Thunder Johnson walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. As they took their places, Isabella looked out at the audience and saw faces that represented the diversity of American music. Young and old, people from all different cultural backgrounds, all brought together by their love of musical expression. They began their performance with Flight of the Phoenix, the piece that had started their partnership. But this version was different from both the original composition and Isabella's reimagining from that night at the Continental Club. Over 3 years of performing together, they had continued to evolve the piece, adding new elements and discovering new ways to make it speak to contemporary audiences. As they played, Isabella thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the young musicians who would benefit from the Bridge Foundation, about the barriers that music could break down, and about the power of authentic artistic collaboration. When they finished Flight of the Phoenix, the audience erupted in applause, but Isabella and Thunder Johnson weren't finished. They had prepared a special surprise for tonight's performance. The debut of a new composition that they had written together specifically for this event. The piece was called Seeds, and it told the story of the Bridge Foundation. It began with simple melodies that represented the basic musical education that every child deserved. Gradually, the music became more complex and beautiful, representing the flowering of talent when young people were given proper support and encouragement. Throughout Seeds, Isabella and Thunder Johnson traded solos that showcased not just their individual abilities, but the musical dialogue they had developed over 3 years of partnership. Their playing had become so synchronized that they could anticipate each other's musical thoughts, creating improvisations that felt both spontaneous and perfectly planned. As the piece reached its climax, they were joined on stage by a group of young musicians from the Washington, D.C. area, recipients of early grants from the Bridge Foundation. These students, ranging in age from 12 to 18, added their own voices to the musical conversation, creating a sound that represented the future of American music. When the final note faded, the entire Kennedy Center audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Isabella looked out at the crowd and saw people wiping tears from their eyes, saw young musicians in the audience looking inspired, saw music educators nodding with approval. But more than that, Isabella felt the presence of her grandmother Rosa, whose wisdom and encouragement had made this entire journey possible. Music was about sharing feelings, Rosa had always said. And tonight, Isabella and Thunder Johnson had shared feelings that connected people across all boundaries. After the performance, as they were greeting audience members and music students backstage, a young girl approached Isabella with a trumpet case in her hand. "Ms. Isabella," the girl said shyly, "I just started learning trumpet last year, and my teacher says I should practice every day, but sometimes it gets boring. How do you keep practicing fun?" Isabella knelt down to the girl's eye level and smiled. "Can I tell you a secret? The best practice happens when you're not just playing notes, when you're trying to share a feeling or tell a story." "What's your name?" "Amanda," the girl replied. "Well, Amanda, next time you practice, try to make your trumpet tell me about something that happened to you this week. Don't worry about playing all the notes perfectly. Just try to share the feeling." The girl's eyes lit up with understanding, and Isabella knew that the Bridge Foundation was going to change lives in ways that she and Thunder Johnson could only begin to imagine. That night, as Isabella packed her grandmother's trumpet away after the most important performance of her career, she realized that the challenge Thunder Johnson had issued to her 3 years ago had been about much more than music. It had been about the courage to step into the unknown, the willingness to learn from others while staying true to yourself, and the understanding that the greatest artistic achievements come from building bridges rather than walls. The young woman from Laredo, Texas, who had once played on her grandmother's front porch, had become part of a musical legacy that would inspire future generations. But more importantly, she had learned that success wasn't just about individual achievement. It was about using your talents to lift up others and create opportunities for the next generation of dreamers. As Isabella walked out of the Kennedy Center that night, she could almost hear her grandmother Rosa's voice on the wind. "Mija, music is not about the notes you play. It's about the feelings you share. And tonight you shared your feelings with the whole world." The old trumpet felt heavy in Isabella's hands as she walked down the dusty street of Laredo, Texas. It was her grandmother's trumpet, passed down through 3 generations of women who believed music could heal anything. The brass was worn smooth in places where countless fingers had pressed the valves, and there was a small dent near the bell that her grandmother always said gave it character. Isabella had been 8 years old when she first picked up that trumpet. Her grandmother, Rosa, had been sitting on the front porch that summer evening, polishing the instrument with an old cloth. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air was thick with the smell of jasmine from the neighbor's garden. "Mija," Rosa had said in her gentle voice, "this trumpet has been waiting for you." At first, Isabella could barely make a sound come out of it. Her cheeks would puff up like a chipmunk, and only squeaky noises would emerge. But Rosa was patient. Every evening after dinner, they would sit on that same porch, and Rosa would show her how to position her lips, how to breathe from deep in her belly, how to make the trumpet sing instead of squeak. "Music is not about the notes you play," Rosa would tell her. "It's about the feelings you share. The trumpet doesn't make music by itself. Your heart does." Years passed and Isabella grew taller, but she never grew tired of those evening sessions. By the time she was 12, she could play simple melodies. By 15, she was performing at local church events and school concerts. But it wasn't until she turned 18 that something magical happened. She had been practicing in her bedroom one afternoon when her phone rang. It was Carlos, a local musician who played guitar at some of the jazz clubs in Austin. He had heard about Isabella through a friend of a friend. "Hey, we need a trumpet player for a gig this weekend," Carlos said. "Nothing fancy, just a small club. You interested?" Isabella's heart started racing. She had never played in a real club before. The only audiences she knew were church congregations and proud parents at school events. But something inside her said yes before her brain could come up with reasons to say no. That Saturday night, she drove the 3 hours to Austin with her grandmother's trumpet case in the passenger seat. The club was called the Blue Note, and it was everything she had imagined a jazz club would be. Low lighting, small round tables, and the lingering smell of coffee and something else she couldn't quite identify. When she walked on stage that night, her hands were shaking. There were maybe 40 people in the audience, but it felt like thousands. Carlos introduced her simply as Isabella on trumpet, and then counted them in. The first song was a slow blues number that she had practiced hundreds of times in her bedroom. But playing it here, with the bass thumping through the floor and the piano painting colors in the air around her, was completely different. When it came time for her solo, something happened that she had never experienced before. She closed her eyes and let the music take over. The notes that came out of her trumpet seemed to have a life of their own. They told stories she didn't even know she had inside her. The audience, which had been chatting and clinking glasses, gradually grew quiet. By the time she finished her solo, you could hear a pin drop. When she opened her eyes, people were staring at her with expressions she had never seen before. It wasn't just appreciation or politeness. It was something deeper. It was like they had just witnessed something special, something real. After the set, a woman with silver hair approached her. "Honey," she said, "I've been coming to jazz clubs for 30 years and I've never heard anyone play with that much heart. You've got something special." That night changed everything for Isabella. Word spread quickly through Austin's tight-knit music community about the young woman from Laredo who could make her trumpet tell stories. She started getting calls from other musicians, invitations to sit in at jam sessions, offers to play regular gigs. Within 6 months, she was playing 3 nights a week at various clubs around the city. She had moved into a tiny apartment near downtown Austin, and her days were filled with practice rehearsals and the kind of musical conversations she had only dreamed about. But success brought its own challenges. Some of the older musicians in the scene weren't immediately welcoming to a young woman, especially one who didn't fit their idea of what a jazz musician should look like. There were comments about her age, her background, her gender. Some people assumed she was just going through a phase, that she would eventually give up music for something more practical. Isabella learned to let her playing do the talking. When someone doubted her abilities, she would simply pick up her trumpet and prove them wrong. She developed a reputation not just for technical skill, but for bringing something emotional and authentic to every performance. Her style was unique in the Austin scene. While many of the local musicians focused on complex technical displays, Isabella played from the heart. She drew on everything she had learned from her grandmother, everything she had absorbed from growing up in a border town where Mexican and American cultures mixed and mingled like ingredients in her mother's cooking. She could play bebop and blues with the best of them, But she also brought in subtle influences from the mariachi music she had grown up hearing, the conjunto rhythms that drifted from neighborhood parties, and the gospel music that filled her childhood church on Sunday mornings. Local music critics started taking notice. A review in the Austin Chronicle described her, playing as technically impressive but emotionally devastating, and noted that she had an uncanny ability to find the human story in every song. Isabella kept that review folded in her trumpet case, right next to a photo of her grandmother Rosa, who had passed away the previous year. Rosa never got to see Isabella perform in the clubs, but Isabella knew she would have been proud. By her 22nd birthday, Isabella had become a regular fixture in Austin's jazz scene. She had a steady Tuesday night gig at the Blue Note, played Thursday nights at an upscale restaurant downtown, and was often invited to sit in with touring musicians when they came through town. She had also started writing her own compositions, pieces that blended traditional jazz with her own cultural influences. Her original songs told stories about growing up on the border, about family traditions, about the dreams of young women who dared to chase something bigger than what was expected of them. But despite all her local success, Isabella knew she was still just a big fish in a small pond. Austin's music scene was supportive and nurturing, but it was also limited. She often wondered what it would be like to play with the legendary musicians she had read about, the ones who had shaped jazz into what it was today. Little did she know that very soon she would get the chance to find out. And that chance would come in the most unexpected way possible, in front of an audience that would change her life forever.